Not so long ago, the potential collapse of the world's youngest country would have been headline news. The main thing at the forefront of minds, from the UN to the African Union. Right now, South Sudan seems to be in the process of sliding into civil war almost by default. The warning signs have been visible since early 2024 and widely acknowledged by everyone from the country's ruling elite to international actors. And yet no one seems to be doing anything to stop it. Instead, the whole world seems to be simply standing by as if binge-watching the lead-up to an explosive series finale. They know it's going to be traumatic and shocking, but just as unable to change it as you or I would be to change the end of a blood-soaked HBO crime drama. The major plot points are already in place. The machinations in the capital that are leading to a deep ethnic split among the elites, the interference by outside powers, a galloping economic crisis exacerbated by refugees and weapons inflows. Feed this into an AI trained to write drama and the output would be obvious. Societal collapse. A return to the civil war that last decade killed some 400,000 South Sudanese. A war that, unless the wider world gets off its butt and does something, may already be inevitable. Prelude to Bloodshed. As warnings go, they don't come much starker than that issued by the International Crisis Group at the start of September. South Sudanese elites are nearly unanimous in their assessment that the young country may be facing a moment of existential peril. Many speak of the possible disintegration of the state. Now, they weren't alone in this assessment. Writing in African Arguments, South Sudanese scholar Gay Madid Kuriom declared that, quote, South Sudan is enmeshed in a structural political crisis with no clear exit. Go digging around online and you can find plenty of quotes like this. Quotes written with the air of people observing the dying days of Germany's Weimar Republic and saying, oh, this doesn't look very good, does it, boys? Now, all of that was before September the 15th, where a call by the opposition for its supporters to mobilize and prepare for regime change was made. Yet talk to most people and they won't have heard anything about South Sudan's impending collapse. Not because there aren't panicked journalists and experts trying to raise the alarm, but because our world is so drowning in war right now that events in Juba just get crowded out. And that's pretty damn unfortunate, because this is one of the few crises happening on Earth that the international community could actually conceivably stop. Founded in 2011, when it split off from Sudan, with which it fought a long war of independence, South Sudan is what gets described in cliched travel guides as a melting pot. Its 12 million or so people are spread across 60 tribes and groups, although two ethnicities do dominate everything, the Dinka and the Nuer. Together, comprising about 50% of the population, the larger Dinka and smaller Nuer were also two of the main factions in the civil war that followed shortly after independence. Although it's defined by ethnic massacres on the streets of the capital, Juba, and eye-watering atrocities committed by all sides. When peace was signed in 2018, the framework forced the leaders of both sides to govern together. Salva Kiir of the Dinka group became president, while his most important vice president in a country with a surplus of them was Riek Machar from the Nuer faction. The idea was that the two would rule together until a path could be cleared for elections. And while Kiir kept delaying them, they're currently due in 2026, having been delayed twice, Machar seems to have been content to simply bide his time under the assumption that he would take over once Kiir died. Now, this was far from a perfect arrangement for ordinary South Sudanese. Between 2020 and 2025, Kiir and Machar seem to have taken governing to being synonymous with looting, stripping the nation of its resources and redirecting money to its elites, with Kiir's private medical unit getting more funding than the rest of the country's healthcare system combined. As a recent UN report described, the country has been captured by a predatory elite that has institutionalized the systematic looting of the nation's wealth for private gain. All this while ethnic fighting and bloodshed continued out in the countryside. Still, there's no doubt that the years of looting saw less killing than the years of war, which is what made Kiir's recent maneuvers oh so dangerous. Aged 73 and in poor health, President Kiir seems to have started panicking about his legacy. Rather than clear the way for Machar, he's gone on a spree of purges, all of which Crisis Group believes are designed to make way for his protege, the businessman Benjamin Bolmel. The problem? Bolmel is Dinka, like President Kiir. For the Nuer watching the high drama in the capital, it's not just that their man Machar is getting purged, it's that they may be watching their rivals secure the whip hand over them for all eternity. Already, the knock-on effects are being felt across the country. Nuer militia like the White Army are starting to mobilize. Clashes have been reported, with the most recent at the time of writing being a September skirmish in Upper Nile State that killed 14 people. And then on September the 15th, the nation's main armed opposition declared the government illegitimate, vowed to pursue regime change, and ordered its supporters to report to military bases for conscription. Clearly, this is a country on the edge of something absolutely terrible. And to understand just how bad things could get, we now have to turn to the last time that the South Sudanese society collapsed. That's right, it's time to dig into the horrors of the Civil War. Backstory. Now, when talking about the different armed factions in South Sudan, it is important to note that the leaders have been involved in conflict for most of their lives. Both Kiir and Machar, for example, were members of the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, which formed in 1983 to fight against Khartoum in the Second Sudanese Civil War. Lasting until 2005, that conflict is what gave birth to South Sudan as an independent nation. One of the key aspects of the peace deal was the right for Juba to hold a referendum on splitting off from its old overlord, which it duly did in 2011. But while Kiir and Machar may have both joined SPLM, that doesn't mean they always fought on the same side. Between 1991 and 2002, Machar led a splinter faction based in his ethnic Nuer stronghold of Upper Nile State, a faction that took money and arms from Khartoum to fight against its old allies. Not that those allies were being led by Kiir at that time. While South Sudan's current president was a powerful figure in the SPLM, he was overshadowed by its founder, John Garang. It's only when Garang died in a helicopter accident in 2005 that Kiir was elected to leadership. And this is important because it meant that Machar and other SPLM elites viewed Kiir as a temporary replacement, one they could shunt aside when the time was ripe. It would be this, more than anything, that helped trigger South Sudan's civil war. Not that conflict seemed inevitable in the heady days of 2011. As The Economist has noted, independent South Sudan had so much oil wealth that it technically counted as a middle-income country, which is likely a shock to anyone who knows it today as one of the poorest nations in the world. A major reason oil wealth was never shared? Well, the elite power struggle that broke out in Juba. Worried other SPLM members were vying to replace him, Kiir sacked multiple government ministers in 2013, including Riek Machar. Furious, Machar created his own group, the Sudan People's Liberation Movement in Opposition, or SPLMIO. Crisis Group describes what happens next. After violence erupted in Juba, South Sudan's army and ruling party shattered into several competing factions, largely along ethnic lines, kicking off catastrophic fighting. It was this ethnic dimension that made the civil war so bitter. Although many groups had united to oppose Khartoum, elites in South Sudan had long used ethnicity as a way to motivate people into fighting for them. Here's how our Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, ACLED, explains it. Quote, political rivals, traditional leaders and business people weaponize identities through hate speech and patronage networks, mobilizing or partnering with armed youth, government soldiers, and mercenaries. Yet while the war was, in the main, a nasty ethnic war, it was also about territory. Machar's Nuer group, you see, is concentrated and at its strongest in the states of Unity, Upper Nile, and Jonglei. And Unity and Upper Nile states just happen to be where the largest of South Sudan's oil reserves are found. So when war broke out, control of the greater Upper Nile region suddenly became super important. The final accelerant hurled onto this bonfire of horrors was the involvement of outside powers. As everything collapsed, Uganda leapt in to keep Kiir's forces afloat, while the Sudanese government in Khartoum gave Machar its backing. And so the stage was set for a gruesome civil war, one that would ultimately kill 400,000, displace millions, and which was defined by endless cycles of ethnic massacres. One which would only end in 2018 when Uganda and Sudan hashed out a peace accord between them. We've already covered the Accord's broad outlines, how it returns Machar to the vice presidency and forced the factions to govern together, how it was supposed to pave the way for elections that never happened, how despite everything it did lead to something that might be called peace, as the main factions traded their guns for a chance to line their pockets. But this peace would turn out to be temporary, because starting in late 2024, Kiir would do something almost unbelievably reckless. He would instigate a wave of purges that would remove senior SPLMIO members from government, threatening to tear up the 2018 peace deal. A wave of purges that would culminate this September with an unbelievable provocation in such a fragile country: the arrest and charging of Vice President Riek Machar with treason. The plot thickens. Now, when we say it's an unbelievable provocation that Machar was charged with treason and crimes against humanity, We don't mean that the charges are undeserved. Even aside from the heinous shit his forces did during a civil war, there is no getting around the fact that Machar is a guy who likes to send armed goons to kill people. When the Nuer White Army overran an army base and captured the strategic town of Nasir in Upper Nile State earlier this year, Machar's fingerprints were all over that shit. By that time, Kiir had already fired plenty of Machar's guys from key posts. Here's how we at WarFronts reported it at the time. A cynical read would be that the White Army's takeover of Nasir was ordered by Machar to help secure the oil-rich region ahead of a potentially renewed civil war. End quote of ourselves. That cynical read is the basis for the charges leveled against Machar. But, and this is the key point, just because Riek Machar almost certainly is guilty of treason and war crimes, that doesn't make his indictment any less explosive, especially when combined with all the other anti-Nuer and anti-SPLMIO actions Kiir is taking. Alongside charging 7 other high-level Machar allies, Kiir has removed his faction from all their government posts. On September the 1st, the president dismissed the governor of Western Bahr al-Ghazal state, replacing him with a member of a splinter SPLMIO faction that is loyal to Juba. As local station Radio Tamazu explains, quote, the 2018 peace agreement granted Machar's SPLMIO the authority to nominate governors for Upper Nile, Western Equatoria, and Western Bahr al-Ghazal states. Kiir has already removed the governors of Upper Nile and Western Equatoria states earlier this year. With the governor's dismissal, Machar's faction no longer holds any gubernatorial posts. End quote. Now, while those might sound like mere political machinations, they are already having consequences on the ground. Crisis Group reports that today, quote, troops are mobilizing in Nuer areas, including Upper Nile, Jonglei, and Unity states. End quote. Then there was the SPLMIO's declaration on September the 15th that the government is illegitimate, a declaration that was accompanied by a call for all the group's supporters to report to bases for conscription and prepare for regime change. Yet it's not only Machar's faction that's arming and recruiting. In June, The Guardian reported on teenagers who'd been disappeared off the streets of Juba during a so-called anti-gang crackdown. So-called there because, according to the story, quoting, parents were reported to be unable to locate their children at detention facilities as allegations surfaced of forced conscription into the South Sudan's People's Defense Forces, the official army of South Sudan. End quote. In short, signs are everywhere that the major factions are preparing for conflict, that Machar's loyalists believe they've been pushed to the limit by Kiir's machinations, while Kiir seems to believe he can score a military victory that he was denied in the previous civil war. Yet this still leaves a major question. Why now? Why is South Sudan imploding today, in 2025, rather than 2 years ago or 5 years from now? Well, one obvious answer is that Kiir may not be around much longer. The 73-year-old Kiir is in such ill health that it'd make Joe Biden tottering onto stage look like Dwayne Johnson unleashing the people's elbow. When Kiir disappeared from public view for a few days earlier this year, rumors flew that he'd died. This is the aspect that Crisis Group's excellent report focused on, the idea that Kiir is dying and is clearing the decks for Benjamin Bol-mel, and that this is causing insane levels of discontent among the elite. As Gal Madit Korion writes in African Arguments, quote, the rapid promotion and political elevation of Benjamin Bol-mel, widely rumored to be the president's preferred successor, has sent strong signals that the government is preparing for a non-electoral, unilateral transition of power. Such actions deepen mistrust, particularly within SPLMIO ranks. End quote. That discontent, by the way, isn't confined to Machar's party. There are rumbles of a split among Kiir loyalists, with even the president's own family divided over Bol-mel's rise. Meanwhile, Machar's SPLMIO has itself broken into 2 factions, one that's loyal to the arrested vice president and one that's pledged to work with Kiir. But while elite divides are driving a large part of the current tensions, there are other reasons why this moment has become so fraught. Reasons that have made 2025 the perfect year for South Sudan to collapse into war. Outside issues. If South Sudan has been politically fragile since independence, the last 2 years have also seen it pass into a state of economic fragility so precarious, it's amazing things have held together this long. In January, The Economist declared that South Sudan was, quote, experiencing perhaps its worst economic crisis since independence. The headline figures are eye-watering. In 2024, inflation hit 120%. The local currency has collapsed against the dollar. So expensive have staples become that street gangs in Juba have seen a recruitment boom among teenagers with no other prospects. At the same time, the state has so little money that it stopped paying its civil servants and soldiers. Here's African arguments again, quote, "Fighters are not paid with salaries, but with access to checkpoints, trade routes, and looted goods. As state revenues dry up, violent control over resource flows replaces institutional taxation." End quote. Now, I mentioned earlier that starving soldiers have taken to setting up roadblocks and shaking down ordinary citizens to ensure they get paid. A more accurate telling might be that the government is so broke that it has resorted to paying its fighters not with cash, but with permission to set up roadblocks, effectively offering the promise of shakedowns in lieu of payment. That's an absurd way to run an army, even in a country as corrupt as South Sudan. That Juba has resorted to it is due to a gigantic outside factor we've so far managed to avoid discussing: the civil war in Sudan. As South Sudan's northern neighbor and former overlord, what happens in Sudan has outsized impact in Juba. And what's currently happening in Sudan is a civil war so apocalyptic that it is threatening to break the country in two. Now, we've covered the Sudan conflict in multiple other videos, so we won't retell the story here. For today's video, what's important is that South Sudan exports its oil overland through pipelines that run across its northern neighbor. These exports make up roughly 85% of government revenues, so when one of the two main pipelines ruptured in 2024, it spelled disaster. The rupture took place along the front lines between Sudan's two warring parties, the Sudanese Armed Forces, SAF, and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, or RSF. As a result, it was too dangerous to repair for over a year. While the oil is now moving again, that lost revenue hasn't magically reappeared, nor is it guaranteed that oil money will keep flowing. Drone attacks by the RSF and oil terminals near the border threaten to once again shut down Juba's exports. Speaking of the RSF and SAF, now might be a good time to mention that Juba's elites are being dragged into taking sides in Sudan's conflict. After trying to remain neutral throughout 2023 and 2024, the Sudan War Monitor claims that Kiir's government started trading with the RSF, giving them fuel in return for weapons. This may explain why the RSF crossed the border into Upper Nile State back in March, where they fought a two-day battle with armed members of Machar's SPLM-IO. But even if there was no gravitational pull sucking South Sudan's factions into the conflict to the north, the sheer intensity of the fighting in Sudan would be enough to destabilize Juba. Here are some facts. Across the whole of 2024, nearly 1 million refugees fled across the border into South Sudan. As we pointed out in a previous video, taking in 1 million refugees last decade was enough to destabilize politics and society in Germany, one of the richest nations in the world. Well, South Sudan, it isn't one of the richest nations in the world, and it's got a population of just 12 million people. So you can imagine the pressure so many refugees would place on society even during a time of peace. Nor are refugees the only source of pressure. There are also bandit groups and criminal gangs, which are now using the chaos in Sudan to set up cross-border networks, as well as a spectacular flood of weapons flowing from north to south. A July report by the United Nations described how the RSF seemed to be funneling sophisticated kit, such as the BRG-55 infantry assault rifle, into South Sudan in exchange for fuel and food to continue their own conflict against the SAF. And this isn't the only example of outside actors getting involved. Uganda has been supplying troops to prop up Kiir's regime since at least spring, with Ugandan forces rumored to have conducted airstrikes on Nasir when it was under control of the White Army. African arguments explain Uganda's interests in the country. Quote, South Sudan serves as a critical market for Ugandan goods, a transit corridor for regional trade, and a buffer against rebel movements along its northern frontier. According to Crisis Group, Machar's faction and others are also hunting for outside backers, although they don't seem to have found any yet. Still, it's safe to say that things are not looking good. Should the RSF become more deeply involved with Kiir's government, then it's likely that the SAF will start backing Machar with arms and gold. To sum up then, South Sudan right now is in the most dangerous position we've seen since the end of the civil war. Its elite, internally divided, its army underpaid and starving, all while ethnic militias are arming, with the SPLM-IO threatening regime change and the warring parties in Sudan pouring fuel onto the fire. Against this backdrop, there's also an intense uptick in charged ethno-nationalist content on social media, content that exists purely to gin up hatreds between the Dinka and Nuer ahead of renewed fighting. Fighting that last time led to door-to-door massacres on the streets of Juba and the rape and mutilation of women based on their ethnic background. Now, we'd love to say at this point that we have a solution, a set of guidelines that we could point to that would stop South Sudan's seemingly inevitable slide into war. But we don't. Like so many others across the world, all we can do is watch from behind our fingers as the world's newest country presses the great big button marked self-destruct. We watch and we pray that through some miracle, civil war can be averted. Because if not, then 2025 may go down as a year in South Sudanese history even worse than 2013. It could go down as the year that the country finally collapsed. Thank you for watching.